I'm jeopardize, the host of ARC News Daily. What's happening in Israel and the Jewish world right now matters, but it can be hard to keep up, let alone make sense of it all. And that's why we started ARC News Daily. Every weekday morning, I walk you through the most important news, give you the context you need, and let you know what to look out for next. I don't try to convince you of anything, and I don't want to waste your time. So on most days, I'll be in your ears for about 10 minutes or less. Then you can move on with your day, hopefully feeling a little smarter than before. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or follow the link in the show notes. I hope to see you tomorrow.
You are listening to an Art Media podcast.
So, Yael, what's your number?
My number is 6.8, and that's 6.8%, and it's Israel's expanded unemployment rate in April, and that is down dramatically, almost half of where it was. It was at 16.6% just a month earlier, if you'll remember. That was the height of the Iran war disruption. And so if you think about that for a second, in the middle of a regional conflict with tens of thousands in reserves and airlines, tourism, retail, all disrupted, the Israeli labor market basically snapped back. And I can tell you from firsthand about snapping back almost immediately after the ceasefire. Job openings are already back above 130,000. So anyone asking about how are things over in Israel? Well, despite all the noise of war, and we still have the noise of war in the background, we have snapped back, and not sure that anyone had any other choice. But what is interesting, and we're going to talk about this later in the show, is at the macro level, Israel still has a labor shortage, especially because of reserves duty, the rebound after the war, and everything we just spoke about. But inside tech, for instance, we're also seeing something very different, and that's a brutal efficiency wave, layoffs, and so forth. We'll get to that. But first, what's yours?
So mine is $375 million. It's not a big number. We usually talk about, rounds of billions or big acquisitions. This one is an acquisition of an Israeli company by U.S. cardiovascular specialty company Artivion. The company that it bought is called Endospan. It's an Israeli company out of Herzliya. The acquisition follows a coveted FDA clearance for Endospan's specialized aortic valve stent. Now, the reason I like this number, although it's not a star number, it's not a $32 billion from the Wiz deal, is that behind it hide tens of thousands of hearts that will be healed through an Israeli technology. It's that simple.
All right. Whose number wins?
I like my heart number, but I'm happy to award you the win this time, because I think at the end of the day, the fundamental of Israel is the agency and the workforce, and to see that bounce back is really inspiring.
All right, let's start.
All right, it is 9 p.m. here in Tel Aviv as we again follow the news closely as the Trump-Xi meeting is over and the unfolding events in the Gulf are now back in the headlines. In the broader context, and we'll talk about that later in the Big Short, is the death of Taiwan's Silicon Dome already within reach, and that will have massive effects on the Israeli economy if that is indeed the case following the Xi-Trump meeting. Yael, what's on your mind?
As I said in our opening, noises of war and the sounds of war is still kind of hanging over our heads like a black cloud.
The drumbeat is still on.
Although I think, I speak maybe only for myself, people have become almost indifferent. As I said, we have to snap back. Life goes on. We have our jobs. We have our families, and we got to kind of just keep at it. But you give me hope when you talk about kind of the big picture in the macro world.
It helps when we're stuck in traffic, which is the main indicator that life is back.
But first, as usual, we're going to take a quick look at some of the week's pressing news, aka our big shorts, and of course, the latest update on the WYNDEX, the What's Your Number Index that tracks the performance of publicly traded Israeli-based or founded companies. All right, Yonatan, how is it looking this week?
Well, WYNDEX is breaking from the pack this week. It's on fire, 8.93% in the green in 1 week. The S&P and NASDAQ are mostly neutral in the past week in the same period. The WYNDEX is 16.7% year to date, compared with 12.87% for NASDAQ and less than 10% for the S&P. Gotta love the WYNDEX. Last year, our listeners got a sense of how the Israeli-founded companies beat both NASDAQ and S&P. It seems like, at least as we record in May, that WYNDEX is, once again superior to the other ones. In the greens, specifically, we have Palo Alto Networks that's driving the growth, 14.59% on the week. This is on the news of a new identity platform that signals a very effective onboarding of the acquired CyberArk, especially technology. Another green week for Nova, as sort of the tide goes up for all the AI, Nova continues to rise. Incredible data in Q1. Yael, get this, almost $250 million in revenue, $235 million on the quarter.
Wow.
That's a rate of $1 billion a year in revenue. Strong demand in both memory and AI markets, as well as a positive outlook for the stock. The leaders of the company from Rehovot, Israel, not the most, the classic, area for Israeli companies of this size, are driving that growth. 6.71% on the week, visiting new highs, market cap records north of $16 billion. That's fourfold where the stock was about 3 years ago. Really impressive stuff.
Truly. And you can really see a common thread through these companies and, names like, as you said, Palo Alto and others keep on getting rewarded because investors kind of see them as the rails of the AI economy. It's companies that are tied to AI infrastructure and security. And unfortunately, that's not what you're seeing in the red.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're seeing a split, what's called the K-shaped dynamic. So in the red, we have one key company. We've been following that very closely over the last 8 to 10 weeks. That's Wix, losing 34% on the week after a share buyback that seems to have failed, at least in the short term, and a set of super aggressive moves by the management to lead in AI. These guys continue to inspire, but the battle is morphing each day. Really, Yael, and we spoke about this a lot. It is so hard to lead through what seems to be a very violent, I just can't find any other word, in terms of velocity and pace of change that AI is bringing to the industry. Via transportation, shedding almost 17% on the week, nearing $1.2 billion market cap, very low compared to its IPO. Several others of our big digs, that's Lemonade and Monday, are in the red to burgundy territory this week. They all have kind of a, forcing mechanism on the industry to change. I think we may be looking at a fundamental shift in the structure of the Israeli tech industry. Look, it's a double whammy effect when it becomes super expensive to hire Israeli engineers due to the strong shekel, right? Like it is now 30% more expensive to hire the same Israeli talent that you had, 2 years ago in comparison. You compound that with the pressure of AI on the SaaS foundation of the industry. So I think we're going to start seeing massive pressure on the industry to shift more into specialty cyber, more into hardware, more into defense tech and other areas where you're more, immune to AI, or Israel has stronger foundations.
For sure. And we kind of focus, especially on the WYNDEX, just on Israeli-founded companies, but you really see it broadly across other parts of the SaaS sector. We saw it with companies like Adobe at different points this year. If Wall Street thinks that AI could commoditize what they do, no buyback or any kind of aggressive moves that we've seen that Wix has taken in the past few weeks is really going to help right now. They're really, Wix specifically, sitting in that global debate of, are they more than just building great AI tools? What does website creation even look like when there's an AI native internet? And that's really kind of most philosophical, foundational questions that I think Wall Street hasn't yet come to terms with.
Yep, I agree. And I think the short term may kind of infuse a Cambrian explosion, right? Like when you see companies collapse, but then out of the ashes of the fire, you see really incredible companies being formed in the other industries where there is bigger demand, where capital is seeking and is willing to pay the salaries and the risk for the returns that fields like silicon, like hardware, like defense tech, like cyber can deliver. So we may be looking at this inflection point in the structure of the industry.
All right, let's start with our first big short at something very timely, talking about the brutal AI economy story out of Israel this week, and that's AI21 Labs is now laying off more than 60% of its workforce, and not because AI is failing, but because it's really evolving too fast. And the company is shrinking from 180 employees to just 70s and pivoting very hard into what it calls AI agent optimization. Basically, they're going to help enterprises manage and control fleets of AI agents reliably and cheaply. This is me in parentheses telling you that there are abundance of companies saying that that's exactly what they do. They've stopped trying to compete heads-on in foundation models, and this is also me in parentheses telling you that was their moat. That was what they kind of started out to do, and now they're going to be focusing on the orchestration layer. I'm bummed because AI21 was kind of the first in its field, maybe even globally. You know, it started out quieter than the Silicon Valley frontier labs, but they were there. And the bigger picture is that now even these AI companies are being disrupted by AI, and the market is consolidating now around infrastructure, efficiency, automation. That's better business. It's fewer people, more compute, more leverage. So the question really is, are we going to be watching a temporary correction in the AI boom like we've been talking about? Or is now like AI really going to be cutthroat to the AI companies themselves?
Look, I think a couple of points here. I think you're making the argument for what may be that kind of forcing mechanism that changes the structure of the Israeli tech industry. You know, you have to love the free market. You have to love capital to see how it drives efficiency. It is a bit critical, somewhat violent, right? These are jobs. These are people at the end of the day. A couple other, multinationals have closed their centers in Israel last week. And you saw immediately how the market was fighting for that talent, right? So I think the talent level at AI21 is kind of top percentile globally. These people will start new companies. They have learned, to your point, foundational models. At the same time, Descartes, another Israeli AI company, just raised another $300 million, now at a $4 billion valuation. I think NVIDIA was one of the kind of players in that capital raise. And so we saw Ken Griffin this week kind of go 180 degrees. This is a guy who, 9 months ago said, AI is moving too slow. We don't see that in the investment space in, a pace that would make a difference. And he was just saying earlier this week that, just considering what happened in the last 3 months, they've changed their opinion. They've replaced PhD level finance experts at his firm, right? And so I think the exponential curve, the knee of the curve is experience, and that drives violent changes, shifts. Again, I'm not really worried about sort of the growth of the tech industry, but it is not going to look the same 12 months down the line. I think you're super right to indicate that AI21 is a bit of a canary of what this is going to look like.
All right. What's your big short?
My big short is sort of the potential death of the Silicon Dome of Taiwan. It was a bit cryptic when I mentioned it when we started the episode, but, we discussed this before how, Taiwan is a model for Israel over the long term in how their command, their, somewhat of a monopoly in the space of silicon, defended them geopolitically. The Xi Jinping and President Trump meeting last week, the most important thing is that you started seeing hints of America being willing to accept Chinese dominance over Taiwan. So, President Trump in the summary talks about how 9,005 miles away from the US, America's not necessarily going to fight that war, and that would be crazy. We also saw, I would say, contributors on Twitter that are very close to the administration starting to leak to the press how the Arizona TSMC factories are successful at the 3 to 4 to 5 nanometer production. This was not achievable 3 years ago. That allowed Taiwan to keep the leverage very strongly. So I would argue, though, what we're witnessing there is the massive leverage that Silicon Dome, that dominance in the wafer industry that kind of kept Taiwan, away from the pack and having it win a geopolitical shield, is now, I think, being questioned. And I think there's doubt around that. Now, the reason I'm talking about it here, which relates to the Israeli economy, what happens if Israel misses out on what is now considered one of its biggest moats, right? Is it going to be cyber? Is it going to be an element related also to silicon, right? Or is it going to be a multinational, presence due to BDS or whatever lies, around the corner? This is very critical for Israel over the span of the next 3 years, be it through defense tech, quantum, robotics, space. We have to keep a very, very close view of how the Taiwan dynamic unfolds over the next 3 to 5 years. And I don't just mean the kinetic war part, but how, if at all, it misses out on its, silicon monopoly, because that's one of the main reasons they're still a free country.
And there's also another second layer to this, which is deterrent. If we do anything to Taiwan or Israel, what happens to the chip ecosystem or the Israel cyber ecosystem? They become indispensable to the global economy, and therefore the world has more of an incentive to protect them. So it's kind of like we said a double whammy before. On the one point, you want to become that superpower, and you have the intel, the people capital, and your small population that you can become that. It's feasible. But on the other hand, you also want to make sure you use it for deterrence purposes as well. And in our time and day, that is definitely something that is important.
Yeah, and again, we are very much dependent on the consequence of our own war, right? Broadly in the region. How is UAE going to respond? How is Saudi going to respond? Is the Middle East going to look the same in 12 months? I think overall, it is fair to say we are witnessing the expiration of many of what used to be a world order with certain, kind of tenets that we all knew were going to just be there. And so I think, that's why the big short there is not about Taiwan. It's about what can we learn in Israel in terms of how strong our moats are when it comes to tech and when it comes to the geopolitics that enables the growth of the Israeli economy.
Let's go to the long play. So, Yonatan, for decades, the U.S.-Israeli relationship felt untouchable. It was strategic, it was political, it was emotional, and Israel has received more than $300 billion in U.S. support since its founding, and since October 7th alone, another $16 billion in military aid. But at the exact same time, government cooperation is deepening. Public opinion, this is not news to anyone in America, is shifting hard in the other direction. A Pew survey shows that 60% of Americans now hold an unfavorable view of Israel. Younger voters in both parties increasingly see Israel negatively, and suddenly something that used to sound fringe, what if America cuts aid to Israel, is becoming a mainstream political conversation from both sides of the aisle. So today I'd like to unpack with you the mythology around American aid. Would Israel actually collapse without it? What does this money really buy? Is it charity or a strategic investment? And maybe most importantly, if the political winds in America are changing, and they seem to be changing, how does Israel preserve the relationship beyond the checks and weapon systems? There's something much more to that relationship. Because the story is really about something bitter, right? It's an alliance that has been built over generations. Now we have to suddenly rewire that alliance and justify it to a new generation.
To me, the most recent kind of expression of this challenge was Tucker Carlson on the New York Times interview a few weeks ago, where he made a fully contradictory argument, and he kept on both ends of that argument. Israel's dependent on the U.S., the military aid. If we just click the button, Israel collapses. That was sort of one argument. The other, Israel controls us. We are the ones being pulled by Israel. So that doesn't kind of make sense. Is Israel dependent? You click the button, Israel dies. So if that's the case, how does Israel kind of, carry get its way, right, in Washington? I think the second piece here is that American aid, military and non, is, kind of a driving force of American foreign policy throughout, I would say the Marshall Plan and subsequent years following the Second World War. The design of the global system that we all know is to a great degree driven by American aid. If you think of countries like Egypt, like Saudi with the petrodollar deal, right? It's not always kind of like a straightforward military aid. The sums of money are infinitely higher than they are as it relates to Israel. There is a degree of anti-Semitism here, of singling out Israel, looking at the big numbers. But I think where we want to focus today, and that's the question of, we kind of framed it in the headline of the episode, the last dance, right? The next MOU, the next Memorandum of Understanding, is now being negotiated. It will come into force in 2028. is this going to be the last military aid deal between the countries? If so, is it going to look the same? And how do we kind of go about understanding how does Israel, move forward while winning, the military, the diplomatic, the political ties, deepening them, but showing to both parts of the aisle that it can basically say goodbye to this level of dependence, or at least the structure of the aid the way it is today. I think we can cover how it was born, what's going on.
Right.
Is it fiscally doable for Israel to avoid? So a lot to cover, a lot to unpack.
So first, let's kind of talk about the aid itself. And Tucker kind of threw the word around, and even the Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he spoke with 60 Minutes, also threw the word aid around. Give us some perspective about how much money aid really means to Israel, proportionate to our own budget. What does it mean in practice?
So this package of aid that relates to military started in the late 1980s. Remember, Israel was climbing out of a horrendous financial crisis, right? 400% inflation, 3 weeks away from its bankruptcy, default on the debt in 1985-86. And so in the early 90s, as part of a broader, I would say, post-Soviet Union policy for the US in the region, America decided to award certain countries a new type of aid that relates to military. Egypt won that, Saudi and others. Israel won $2.8 billion of aid per year. Let's talk about the structure. Back in the day, this was a significant number because the size of the Israeli economy was $60 billion. So it's almost 5%, right? It's huge. It is really significant. How does it work? It's not really aid in terms of we get cash, we do whatever we want. This has a lot to do also with Israel at the time developing a fighter jet that could have been competitive to the F-16. Part of the decision that Israel made to kind of close that project had to do with how military aid would look like. So this was not just kind of Israel begging and getting something. The mechanism is we get US dollar aid and we have to buy in the US for the total sum of the aid. So if the aid is $2.8 billion, the money stays in the US. It doesn't go to Israel and then Israel develops on its own or goes to buy stuff outside. So that's the genesis of that. Now let's fast forward 40 years, right? The aid, the Obama era aid, the last MOU was $3.8 billion. Realistically speaking, it's still the same 2.8 from before, kind of adjusting for inflation. The Israeli economy multiplied by 10, basically. It's a $600 billion economy. So I think right now, and the Prime Minister is right to say fiscally, this is not a big deal. This is less than 1% of the economy. And if we want to make that statement towards the Tuckers of the world, towards the left-hand side of the aisle, but also I think truthfully speaking, Israel can do without the aid from a fiscal perspective.
On the fiscal angle, where do you think it would hurt Israel the most short term? And then, of course, long term we'll get to.
So look, I think ultimately as a $650 almost billion economy with 68% debt to GDP, now where we stand after a massive $120 billion unexpected spend on the war, right? All we need to do is extend our debt to GDP by 1%. So again, I don't think that's what we should do. I'm just saying that if we want to click a button and kind of have it go back to zero, the Israeli economy can sustain that. It's either a cut of the budget, broadly speaking, or expanding the debt to GDP, which is in a very healthy perspective. Yeah, just to give a number to our listeners, the central bank in Israel holds foreign currency reserves that are close to $250 billion. Like we can sustain 50 years, right? So that's just a matter of scale. But honestly, it's not about the fiscal dynamic. I should say maybe one last thing here before we kind of go into the broader kind of bilateral relationship and what that does. We speak about these numbers, you kind of tally them, $300 billion over 80 years and so on. You can play a lot with these numbers. So this is not a fiscal story for Israel. It has $660 billion with phenomenal debt to GDP, rates that allow us that flexibility. And it is, frankly, not a big deal fiscally for the US, considering $1.5 trillion defense budget coming into the Pentagon and almost a $40 trillion economy. So from a fiscal perspective, it is time to move on.
So one thing before we go beyond fiscal that caught my year is, you said, 120 billion costs of the Iran war. It's safe to say that war will happen again. And so it's probably smart to factor war as a recurring theme in the Israeli budget.
It depends on also how fast the Israeli economy grows. Currently, the IMF is projecting actually very healthy growth over the next few years. And yeah, again, if the Israeli economy grows by an extra 0.5%, you don't need that, right? So point being, I agree with the prime minister. I agree with the point that from a fiscal perspective, it's time to Israel to wean itself from that. It was critical for us. It was almost 5% of the GDP. Now it is less than 0.5% of the GDP. This is, kind of 2 orders of magnitude in 40 years. Time to continue to walk past the aid model in this relationship.
And when we talk about aid, we also, as you said yourself, historically, there's been a lot of, vested interest of the U.S. in this region, and it wasn't kind of just aid, right? So maybe a future cooperation looks like just aid and more like kind of a strategic venture partnership.
Right. No, and I think you're spot on. This is the negotiation now underway in Washington as we start kind of the contour of the last dance, if you will, right? It's not going to be strictly aid. That's sort of what I'm hearing in the sort of, I would say, the corridors of those who are at play here. It's not going to be strictly aid. There's going to be a model, as you've really insightfully kind of framed it. It's kind of like a joint venture fund. Now, just to give you a sense, the Wall Street Journal argued this week in an opinion ed that America needs to have one of its biggest data centers in the region, not so much in the Arab Gulf, which proved itself to be very vulnerable, right? But actually in the Negev in Israel. That argument was made on the pages of the Wall Street Journal last week. Israel's now part of the State Department's Pax Silica. We discussed this on the pod, right? So a broader perspective of what mutual national security interests look like. How do we co-invest, right? Is it the next Arrow system, Arrow 4, which is already kind of co-founded by the US, and how that fits in with the Golden Dome?
I actually am thinking about, the cultural connection. This is maybe the hardest part here is the human connection. There's been a web of connectivity between the two countries since Israel's establishment, even before the establishment. Money is measurable. And as you've pointed out very articulately, it's becoming less and less of a dependency on the Israel side and also unimportant on the American side. But there is kind of an emotional infrastructure that has been laid down over the decades. And the deepest risk, I think, in my mind, is really cultural separation. What do we tell the new generation, right? What is this new relationship?
Yeah.
What will be special about it?
So I think, we're talking about a narrow piece of the broader bilateral relationship, right? That's military aid. I think all the rest continues to kind of move forward. That is NASDAQ, that is New York, that is San Francisco, that is Judeo-Christian values. I think that kind of broader spectrum remains. The question is, and I think your intuition sort of leads to a very important place, in 4 decades of aid, and again, remember, aid means we get the dollars, we spend them in the US. We don't get them and do whatever we want. There have been hundreds of thousands of connections created, jobs created, tens of thousands of jobs in the US as they relate to producing the F-35s, the F-15s, the Iron Domes, the Arrows, the components, right? And the bilateral dynamics in which we actually generate, inventive technology that then goes back and perfects further the American arsenal of democracy, as it is called in the Pentagon. It's a very nice reference to the weapons of war, to call them the arsenal of democracy. But at the end of the day, how do you preserve what mechanism, joint venture investment, whatever they decide and negotiate on, how do we not lose the web of connections that are very profound of tens of mayors, key governors, people who've intertwined themselves. They visit Israel once every 2 to 3 years to see what the jobs that were created in their respective region, right? Mm-hmm. What do they contribute to on the Israeli side and the other way around? That is, to me, the main question. The fiscal piece is doable. What kind of structure allows for this really profound web of relationships to not only remain, but to continue to thrive?
And you layer on that the negative or increasingly negative views that more and more Americans have.
Right.
That does keep me up at night.
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, when American tech is going defense tech, when you look at Palmer Luckey that calls himself a proud Zionist, right, on record.
Right.
When you have the likes of Alex Karp, when you have the likes of Elon Musk, spoiler alert, stay with us towards the end of the episode in a few minutes. I actually think that within defense tech, if you don't operate within an aid framework and you co-invest, then you can get a flurry of new relationships to kind of be born that are actually adequate and reflective of the current, moment in time for the US and for Israel. There's a lot that we can do. I will say, to kind of conclude on that thought, when you double click on the data that relates to Israel and favorability, aid is sort of like an excuse. I don't expect that finishing aid or restructuring it will make a big impact there. I just think it's the right thing to do. And the reason I don't think it's going to make a big difference is, if you kind of look at the dominant variable driving the challenges to Israel, it has a lot to do with anger of Americans against America. It's very reminiscent of the late 60s and the Vietnam War and the objection by average Americans to the very use of military power. And as an extension, Israel is the one being portrayed and kind of thrown into that context. But it is more profound than Israel's action in the Middle East or one way or another, what we will or will not do with the military aid. And I think it's a broader story than just kind of Israel or opinions towards Israel as they relate to what's going on in the Middle East.
So look, I think this is a complex issue, and you can probably find the pros and cons of each side. On the one hand, if Israel stops receiving U.S. aid, will this look like a win for the lawmakers and the constituents in the U.S. that have been asking for this? At the same time, I cannot unhear the Israeli Prime Minister on 60 Minutes, who also said that he doesn't need to be dependent on U.S. aid. And he said it in a way of triumph, of kind of showing that Israel doesn't need to be dependent, and kind of along the lines of what you're saying of how minuscule it is in the Israeli budget in the grand scheme of things. So when you look at public opinion in the U.S., I agree with you that this is not going to make it or break it in terms of favorable opinions towards Israel, because as it is, the rise of anti-Semitism is well on its way. I do think that narratives are being written as we speak, and that we need to get ahead of it in terms of understanding exactly what is, this episode does part of it, of what is exactly military aid to Israel, and what part of it is a proportion of it is it for the budget, and what strategic interest America has in this region as well. But I do worry about the negative opinions with or without the aid, the fraying of the cultural connections, as you said, about the jobs being kind of cut after aid is being cut. But, there's a lot more around it. And the fraying of public opinion is very much felt. And yeah, I think that train has left the station.
Look, I think either way, what's being negotiated is going to take a decade as a sunset. So I don't think we're going to see jobs lost within an instant. I also think there is fundamentally an open free market logic, strategic logic for Israel and the US. It is far bigger than the $4 billion in aid. So I don't expect that to change. The strategic kind of path on which both economies and defense industries are, I don't think they could ever be stronger than they are right now. The Pentagon calls Israel its model ally. So I actually think we're on a good path there. But I think you're raising two important issues. One, once it's not aid, it's not run through the Appropriations Committee. It's not run through the political process, right? So it's less susceptible to that kind of pressure. I think that's a big win, that people don't go to the Hill to protest that. I think that's very important. And the relationship becomes a sort of business-like relationship. They'll have to protest the Lockheeds, the Boeings. That's a far more difficult, challenge than it is to lobby certain people in Congress, in the Appropriations Committee. So I think from that perspective, it's actually in the benefit of Israel. Beyond it just being the right thing to do. The second piece is, and this is a concern, is Israel going to wake up a decade from now to an embargo, right? To legislation says you should not sell arms to Israel, full stop, irrespective of whether or not it's financed through an aid package or through shekels, right? That's a good question. I think it's very hard to predict, but it is a risk that Israel runs irrespective of sort of what happens in the next, kind of year or two. One last thought to kind of leave you with. Germany, India, other countries that are now vying for Israeli technology, willing to pay for it. Some other countries, Azerbaijan, South Korea, other countries. I think that Japan, to an extent, I think that Israel also needs to show to the U.S. that it can serve much of those, joint interests, globally speaking, beyond sort of I'm buying this from you, and we have this symbiotic relationship, and sort of that's also a leverage for you, and it's a dependency for us. That potential broadening is actually maybe a very healthy outcome of the change to the structure of the defense financing in between the two countries.
All right, so we still have a few more years ahead before this kind of cuts short. There's going to be a gradual, as you said, it will take a few more years until we see an end to this. Let's go to the words of the week.
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, there's going to be a recalculation, an American recalculation of its alliances worldwide. This dynamic with Israel is also reflective of what we're seeing with Germany, with NATO, and so on. And in this type of atmosphere, it's always great to hear titans, leaders in America, in the industry, and close to Washington, kind of speak freely about Israel and what they think. Such a statement was made today on the 18th of May by none other than Elon Musk, who admits, in a way, I'm paraphrasing, in his video remarks in a big mobility conference here in Israel today, that he loves the WYNDEX. Not per se, but here's what he had to say about Israeli entrepreneurship. I'm a big fan of the entrepreneurship that comes from Israel. Israel's achieving amazing results relative to the size of its population, and definitely number one in the world. I take my hat off to Israel for its innovation. I think these are great words of the week to finish with, and it gives me a lot of hope to know that people of that caliber that just came back from China and witnessed all they saw there, and they're really at the bleeding edge of robotics, of autonomous cars, of space, of Neuralink, of advanced AI and healthcare, that's what they think, not just about Israel, but of Israeli entrepreneurs worldwide. That's why I made the WYNDEX comment.
Well, I'm just bummed that we didn't get an in-person Elon Musk. He was supposed to be here for the conference, and you can think of a million excuses why he wasn't able to get here. But nice to hear, and nice for the audience. And yes, there was not one Israeli media outlet that didn't have this as its top story for a couple of minutes this evening. So. Good news is always a blessing. All right.
Yeah. All right. That's it for today's show. So thanks for tuning into ARC Media's What's Your Number? We hope you found it interesting. The topics today were, profound. They have a lot of impact on the Israeli-American relationship going forward. So if you did, be sure to like, subscribe, rate, review. You know the drill. Most importantly, share it with others who you think will find it interesting. If you want to make suggestions, share your feedback, do it on our social media, or also reach out to us at whatsyournumber@arcmedia.org.
What's Your Number is an ARC Media podcast. What's Your Number's interim executive producer is Beth Perlman. Production manager is Brittany Cohen. ARC Communities manager is Ava Wiener. Sound and video editing is by Liquid Audio. Our theme music is by Midnight Generation. I am Yael Wissner-Levy.
I'm Yonatan and Yael. See you here next week. This podcast offers general business and economic information and is not a comprehensive summary for investment decisions. It does not recommend or solicit any investment strategy or security.